have this recurring nightmare about being in danger. There's someone in front of me who's threatening my life. Sometimes it's my old Smith & Wesson .38 revolver that I have in my hand. Sometimes it's a Glock 9mm pistol. I point it at him, need to shoot him, but the trigger doesn't move. The trigger won't move. That's a pretty scary dream. It's impossible to get out of.
19 heavily armed police surrounded this house, and almost immediately the assault started to go wrong.
Fugitive Paul Mullen fired, hitting Kid 5 times.
I said to him, hang in there, mate, I'll see you in the hospital in a while. I went downhill mentally and emotionally, for sure.
The gunman apparently fired shots into the Central City building before storming in.
This was a big story.
He said, put that fucking gun down or I'll blow the fucking place up. If it all goes to shit, I get blown up, you can blame me. In 1982, I'd gone back to being a uniformed cop, which was pretty boring after 2 years as an undercover agent. I'd become used to a high-octane lifestyle, living on my wits and making my own decisions. I'd become pretty cynical about the world around me. I didn't know who to trust anymore. I didn't want to leave the force. I loved being a cop. But I needed an outlet to satisfy my thirst for adrenaline. Yep, this was the next adrenaline hit that I found. I put an application in, I was interviewed and accepted as a trainee in what was then known as the emergency squad. A squad that dealt with domestic sieges, armed interventions, high-risk raids, etc. And my adrenaline addiction was filled because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be where the action was. So the emergency squad evolved over the next few years into the tactical response group. I was trained in bomb disposal. I learned how to blow things up. And I was sent to Perth to train with the SAS at their barracks. I'm always happy when I had a gun in my hand. I was in it with a bunch of men who were like-minded, all with the same intent, which was to protect people and do jobs the average cop couldn't. I was developing relationships with a team I came to trust implicitly. Guys like Peter Kidd, who I met on the rifle range on one of the first training days. Steve Grant was another integral part of the team. He became like a brother to me. We all had each other's backs, but were about to be overtaken by events that none of us could control.
Four Corners pursued its inquiries without official cooperation. Our film team was harassed and their equipment smashed. Here's Chris Masters in the Moonlight State.
I don't know of any illegal gambling. If there's any going on, well then of course I don't know where it is.
Despite its unmarked entrance, the public, unlike the police, had no trouble finding the place.
As far as the illegal gambling and prostitution industries were concerned, there were pretty much two syndicates that were operating. One was the Bellino Syndicate, run by members of the Bellino family.
Tony was getting a little annoyed.
What? Right, you fellas, got enough fun with your camera. Break his camera, break his mouth too.
Break his camera and break his mouth too was the order. During our research, we received more detailed information about corruption, more particularly in senior police ranks. Who is there to turn to? Who, for instance, could properly investigate allegations raised in tonight's program?
It wasn't until May 87 that the Moonlight State program went to air. And I remember sort of saying, please, just for once, why doesn't somebody just do something, you know? And Gunn did.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, regarding allegations and other recent claims against the police, I've decided that the government will initiate an independent inquiry.
You can actually see the cabinet minutes where they link the calling of the Fitzgerald inquiry to the Four Corners report. When I first started talking with the Fitzgerald investigators, I remember one of the lawyers grabbed me by the I was in the toilet, and he grabbed me by the shoulders and he pushed me up against the wall and he said, "You're going to bloody help us because we're serious." And I got the message after a while that they were actually serious.
Unlike some of the bosses, my mates and I in the tactical response group were all good, honest cops. We had nothing to fear from any inquiry. But it turns out we were about to be put to the sword ourselves. Called in by the boss, I was a team leader, and we were tasked with an operation that was to be mounted on an address in Virginia, in Brisbane. I was told about a man who lived in this house, the most wanted man in Queensland, and one of the most wanted men in Australia. Paul James Mullen, a psychopathic, violent, armed robber.
This is probably one of the most dangerous and violent hoodlums that ever came to Queensland, certainly in my living memory. After breaking out of Long Bay, Mullen had made his way around Australia. He was desperate, dangerous. He was a natural-born killer, as we might say. He was prepared to kill to stay on the run.
He'd survived by doing armed robberies all through Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales. He had cold-bloodedly shot a security guard in a bank in Perth for no reason other than he felt like it. He'd shot another security guard in Sydney for the same reason. He simply got a thrill out of violence.
He turned up in Queensland, sadly for everyone. There was a romantic interest somewhere along the way with a woman and 2 kids. That caused police great consternation.
When I was called in by my boss, I was briefed about the house in Virginia where Mullen was living with his de facto and her 2 kids. We've got surveillance on the house. We need you to put together an operation order as to the best way to arrest him. I discussed all the options with the team. We considered arresting Paul Mullen while he was out and about in public. But the problem was, he never left home without a military-grade Ruger .223 rifle. If he'd opened up on us with that rifle, the rifle round travels for around 2 kilometres and can be lethal at that distance. So we thought, if he shoots at us and misses us and a member of the public's killed, that's just not acceptable. We thought about surrounding the house and calling on him to come out. We discounted that because we were confident he would take that woman and her 2 children hostage, and that would not end well. He'd vowed he would never be taken alive, so we were only left with the option of smashing the door in and getting him in the early hours of the morning. I'd taken my first briefing on the Mullen arrest plan on Monday, July 27, 1987. That's a significant date in the history of Queensland. It was the week of the Fitzgerald inquiry into police corruption. Things weren't looking good already.
After 6 weeks of preparation, the Fitzgerald Commission stepped into high gear. First to take the stand was Queensland's Police Commissioner of 11 years, Sir Terence Lewis.
Terry Lewis was called up to the inquiry on the Monday. The same day, we were ordered to begin the operation to arrest Paul Mullen. So we were instructed when we were to go in and execute this warrant, which never happened. We were the ones who ran the timing ordinarily, but we were instructed when to go in. We were told we had to go in on Wednesday, July 29. We had less than 48 hours to plan the arrest of the most dangerous man in Queensland. All at a time when a roll call of top brass were being called before the Fitzgerald inquiry hearings. I still firmly believe that those in command were wanting to have a headline that would take away attention from the Commission of Inquiry into Corruption. They got the headliner right, and the headline was police officer murdered in the line of duty. It was the morning of the raid, codenamed Operation Flashdance. We'd been up all night working on our strategy. And now, before dawn, 19 police officers were driving through the streets of Brisbane, ready to arrest Mullen. The first assault team comprised of me and my good mates, Steve Grant, Jeff Zeeth, Don Green, and Peter Kidd. We'd agreed to mount the assault by forcing entry through the back door. At precisely 5:30 a.m, it was still dark in winter, we moved to the back door with Peter Kidd leading the way. I agreed for Pete to be number one in through the door because he outshot me on a challenge. I said, if you can outshoot me, you can do it, and he outshot me. Because we were alpha males, everyone wanted to be number one in through the door. It was complete blackness, complete darkness, and we were very close to each other. We triggered the mini mag light torches attached to our weapons. Then we made our way through the house towards the bedroom where we believed Mullen was located. Mullen opened fire on us. I saw Peter shot 4 times in the upper body. Steve was shot in the lower abdomen. Then 2 of us stepped over Steve and went in and shot Mullen. Mullen died. I went in and sat with Pete while we were waiting for the ambulance to arrive, and he had all of those bullet holes in his upper torso and was bleeding all over my gloves, so I held his hand and waited till the ambulance arrived. He told me things to tell his wife. And I said to him, hang in there, mate, I'll see you in the hospital in a while. And that was it. That's the last time I spoke to him.
Peter Kidd was to turn 30 on Saturday. He died an hour after the raid started. Detective Stephen Grant has serious stomach wounds. Mullen, at 32, had been the state's most wanted man for more than 2 years.
Police denied they underestimated.
I am quite satisfied that they did do their homework very correctly. I attribute absolutely no blame at all to the police officers that were involved in this matter.
Main criticism has centred on the so-called bulletproof vests.
We were using what were called level 2 vests that fitted under the shirt, and they were only ever designed to stop shotgun fire or pistol fire. The lightweight ballistic vests we were issued with were sadly no match for the bullets fired by Mullen's military-grade Ruger.
It's an internal matter for the police. They're skilled in that particular area. I'm not.
If the police minister had paid more attention to his portfolio, he would have known that Peter Kidd wrote a detailed report recommending an upgrade to our ballistic vests. That report was ignored, a fact the team was painfully aware of in the hours before the raid on Mullen's house. Ironically, the night before, when Peter was getting all the vests out and laying them all out on a table, one of the detectives said, "So, mate, will they stop at 223? And Pete looked at him and said, "I'll go through that vest like a hot knife through butter." And then a few hours later, he was dead. This was a very bitter pill to swallow. We'd been forced into a rushed operation without the right equipment. Now, my mate's death was the headline on the front page of the paper. Terry Lewis and his corrupt cronies were meanwhile relegated to the inside pages.
Police Commissioner Lewis today described Senior Constable Kidd as a reliable, friendly officer who was respected by all his colleagues. He'll receive a funeral with full police honours, possibly later this week. Dean Felton, National 9 News.
"19 heavily armed police surrounded this house in Walter Street, Virginia at 5 o'clock, and almost immediately the assault started to go wrong.
It was one of the Queensland Police Service's blackest days. One of their own gunned down in a hail of bullets.
A lot of that's a blur to me. I look at footage and I see myself as one of the pallbearers, and I'm traumatised. I can see it now. In police terms, it was a funeral with full honours. The police commissioner, Terry Lewis, who was under fire at the time with the Fitzgerald inquiry, was there. He led the march.
Hundreds of police, led by Sir Terence, escorted the cortege from the church.
There were members of the government there. The person that missing was the police minister, because he was busy opening a Martyr Prize home. We never forgot the disrespect that he showed that day.
His work done, Tony Fitzgerald QC left the executive building, slipping quietly out of public eye. The focus shifted to the media lockup, where hundreds of reporters waited for access to report on the report.
I think that when Fitzgerald reported, a lot of people saw an opportunity for catalytic change, you know, but he did a great thing for the state and the nation. I can't remember the amount of prosecutions that came out of it, but it was something like 120, 130.
Of all the stories about crooked cops in Australia, the allegations against Terry Lewis were the most shocking. Confessed bagman Jack Herbert told the Fitzgerald inquiry and then a Brisbane jury that their police commissioner had been on the take for years. Lewis stood expressionless as Judge Healy imposed the maximum sentence of 14 years.
Until the day he died, you know, Terry Lewis insisted that everybody had got it completely wrong, that he was as innocent as the driven snow.
Never took a cent.
Not a cent.
Sir Terence is tonight in prison, starting his 14-year sentence. He's expected to lodge an appeal.
Russ Hinds resigned, of course. The special branch was disbanded. An electoral reform commission was started in Queensland, which at last broke the gerrymander. Of course, there was a change of government after 30 years of National Party rule.
I'd like to thank Queenslanders. I'd like to thank the ordinary people of this state.
The biggest thing, though, I think, was that at last that copper who joined the police force to do the right thing was able to do the right thing.
I've always tried to do the right thing, but nothing prepared me for the loss and guilt I felt after my mate Peter Kidd was shot dead by Mullen. For probably 32 years, I carried what I now know as survivor guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder survivor guilt.
I think when it comes to Dad's friendship with Peter Kidd, that was something that he didn't like to talk about a lot. When we were younger, I think it's always been one of the toughest things for Dad to talk about.
I went downhill mentally and emotionally, for sure, but I didn't know what was happening to me.
And I think how Dad details his kind of descent into that depressive state, you know, after that event. Yeah, I think now anyone would be able to recognise that that was a traumatic response or that was a response of mental illness. But at the time, he had no idea what was going on and no language for it.
About 6, 7 weeks later, I can't remember, I was sitting at home and I was drinking heavily to sleep. And I sat there with the pistol, cocked it back, which chambered around a bullet into the pistol, turned it, put it in my mouth and thought, all I've got to do is squeeze this trigger and all the pain goes away. I was living with a young lady then who I later married, my first wife. She was out for the evening, so I was at home alone. I had a flashback to a suicide I'd gone to where this fellow had shot himself with a .303 rifle and literally taken the top of his head off. And I remember thinking, well, if I do that, she's going to come home and find all this brain matter and stuff, and she'd never get over it. And that's why I took it out of my mouth. In that moment of clarity, I thought, good God, I'm in big trouble here. I'm in really big trouble.
It is mind-boggling to me that someone can go through that, you know, experience quite fierce suicidality as well, and then somehow make it through. What gives people that resilience? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Where does it come from? How does one get through it? He experienced all that, didn't have the language for it, didn't receive assertive, you know, help, and somehow made it out the other side. It's quite extraordinary.
I actually left the marriage a couple of years later. I just was in such a state of darkness and emotional disconnection that I just woke up one morning and said, I can't do this anymore, and left. I had no plan. I slept in my office for 3 nights, I think, trying to figure out what I was going to do. So that was a really dark time of my life, and I will forever be remorseful about how my first marriage ended.
Keith Banks was alive across the police force by reputation before I met him. I met him coincidentally. I hadn't worked with him, but I was with a number of other young detectives when we had the chance to meet him. Detectives by their nature are very keen listeners, and I was keen to hear everything he had to say. He came across to me as being smooth, confident, worldly. He'd been involved in adventures I could only dream about. When that conversation finished, I thought to myself, Keith Banks is a bloke who was scared of nothing and no one.
The tragedy of my situation was that I didn't think I could share my PTSD with anyone. I never ever said I was suicidal or had suicidal ideation. I never said I was struggling overtly because I knew that they'd take me away from that. And that's what I lived for. My strange double life came to a head in 1988 when the Tactical Response Group was sent to a siege on the Gold Coast. A man had taken his mother hostage in a block of units.
The gunman locked himself in a third-floor unit and fired at police. With a .22 caliber rifle, he smashed police car windows and threw a petrol bomb at one car with officers inside.
And I remembered standing outside this guy's unit and he fired a couple of shots and I turned to someone and said, I'm going to kill this prick. And I had no emotional intuition or EQ or anything. I just made up my mind I was going to kill him. Luckily, that didn't happen. But another officer did have to shoot the offender when we stormed the unit.
The offender was then called upon to drop the weapon, which he refused to do, and he was shot in the right shoulder.
The gunman was injured, not fatally, and his mother was unharmed. But I woke up the next day and thought, the dark side's taking me over. This is not the Keith Banks that I want to be. And I went to my boss and said, I've got to go. I've got to go somewhere else. And this time, strangely enough, the department actually looked after me and sent me to somewhere I wanted to go to, which was back in the world of covert operations in Bureau of Criminal Intelligence. For the next 3 years, I worked in covert and surveillance roles. I started training and handling a group of undercover agents. I found that very satisfying, considering I'd had no backup when I was undercover. Then I moved back to Major Crime Squad as a detective sergeant. Yes. This was a photo taken just after a surveillance job when I was in the BCI, and the hair's back, the attitude's back. 27th of November, 1993, I was rostered on an 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift to control a couple of undercovers. I think it was around 2:30. We'd finished what we were doing and we decided to drive back to headquarters. And as we were driving along Coronation Drive, and any unit call came over the air. Any unit in the vicinity MLC building, shots fired.
Yeah, I want the SERT here, I want negotiators and also the LRT. There's been another shot fired, we think.
We raced into the city and pulled up in front of the MLC building. More information had come over the radio by then. A gunman had entered the building and started firing randomly. This guy had to be stopped. I've jumped out of my car looking like this. With a firearm in my hand, I raced up the stairs with the intention of shooting the guy if I had to. Straight back into full-on tactical mode. I entered the lobby of the MLC tower and there found the only cop inside the building, Sergeant Mal Harrison, taking cover behind a pillar. And I said, right, where is this prick? And he said, Banksy, he's around here. And so I did a quick peek around the corner and saw this guy sitting on the floor with a rifle across his lap, a cardboard box, and army webbing. And he said, put that fucking gun down or I'll blow the fucking place up. And I went, whoa, take it easy, take it easy. Pulled my badge out, showed him a badge, and he said, why don't you come in and have a talk to me? And I still have no idea why I did. After handing my revolver to Sergeant Harrison, I gingerly walked down the corridor to where the gunman sat with all his gear around him. Let's take it easy, mate. My name's Keith. What's your name? He said, my name's Frank. I was worried about the rifle, and I saw he had his finger laid across the trigger guard, like someone who's trained would do. And I thought, uh-oh. I said, what do you got in the box, Frank? And he reached in and pulled out half a stick of something and threw it to me, and I caught it, and it was sweating gelignite. Sweating gelignite is when the nitroglycerin leaches through the outer wrapping, and that makes it volatile, and it can explode very easily, like if you dropped it on the floor. And I thought, wow. So I handed that to Mal, who stayed with me during this whole thing. Our problem wasn't solved just because I caught the stick of gelignite. Turned out, Frank had 15 more sticks and 3 detonators in his cardboard box. And in the meantime, Frank lit a cigarette, smoking over unstable gelignite. He had 3 electronic detonators all wired into it, and being an ex-bomb squad guy, I knew exactly what it was. And he had a 12-volt battery with his right hand on the rifle and his left hand smoking, but the 2 wires ready to go. So all he needed to do was attach them, the positive and negatives, and the whole thing would have gone up.
The gunman apparently fired shots into the Central City building before storming in. Police say it's not clear why the man, armed with a rifle and carrying explosives, targeted the building.
In 1993, I was running Channel 9's Gold Coast operations in their newsroom when news broke that the MLC siege was underway. The media were listening to everything that was going on the police networks through the radios. We had a madman in there with a gun and 16 sticks of leaking gelignite. I mean, the whole place was about to go up. This was a big story.
first thing I need to do is try and talk him out of the rifle. So I said, so Frank, what's it going to take for me, you know, to take the rifle, mate? He said, a 6-pack of beer. And I said, can't get you a 6-pack, but let me see what I can do. So I went outside to an inspector and I said, what I need is a pot of light beer. And he said, he's horrified. He said, you can't give him beer. And I said, well, if it all goes to shit, I get blown up, you can blame me. 10 minutes later, I make the exchange with Frank. 1 pot of beer for 1 rifle. Now it was time to build trust. Tell me your story. He said, when I came back from Vietnam, I had no money. He was a Vietnam vet. That was interesting. But he also had a superannuation account with MLC. So 2 days before, he'd gone in to try and cash his superannuation in the small amount that he had, and he was laughed at by, as he called him, a little person in a tie laughed at me. The guy who Frank said laughed at him worked for MLC, and that's what triggered him. 2 days later, he's come back into town armed to the teeth, ready to take his revenge. He had the means. Having served as a combat engineer in Vietnam, Frank knew guns and he knew explosives. So we sat there and talked about all of that. He talked about his nightmares. He talked about things, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, he's got what I've got. Shit. So I started talking about my stuff as well. And we had this interesting relationship that developed pretty quickly, which was us against everyone else. And I deliberately fostered that. And during it all, I said, mate, there's got to be another way. There's got to be another way. I was definitely making progress with Frank, but he was still extremely volatile. At one stage, I think I got ahead of myself. And I said, so what we need to do is, if you come out with me, we get the media, mate, this will make front page, and you can get your revenge on this guy by telling his story. He went, yeah, I probably could. He said, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you I had this. And he pulled a hand grenade out of his webbing. And then he took the pin out.
I believe he has a hand grenade in his hand with the pin out.
A hand grenade fuse has about 5 to 7 seconds by the time the handle's released. I thought, even if I get out, I can't make the door. The bomb will sympathetically detonate and we're all gone, we're all dead. I said, mate, I've got enough fucking nightmares now. You're not going to be another one of them. Can you please put the pin back in? And he looked at me and he said, you're fair dinkum, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I'm not going anywhere, mate. And he went, ah. And he put the pin back in, thank God. Frank allowed me to pass the grenade on to Mal, who took it outside the building to safety. So, we've got the rifle, we've got the grenade, but Frank's still got 15 sticks of gelignite primed and ready. So I'm sitting there with this guy with a bomb, and suddenly my pager went off. This was in the days when we all had pagers, not mobile phones. And this page was from my girlfriend, who I'd agreed to pick up after my day shift. And he said, what's wrong? I said, I'm in deep shit, mate. He said, what? And he said, is your boss or something? And I said, no, it's my chick. Apparently I'm late to pick her up. And he looked at me and he said, well, when you get home tonight and you tell her what's happened, she'll understand. And I thought, gotcha. Soon after that, Frank agreed to my proposal to take him to hospital to be assessed by a psychiatrist. He said, one condition. What's that? No handcuffs. No problem, mate, no problem. With that, he moved the battery away. He tied both ends of the wires together, which then makes the device null. And he stood up and he said, I'll take you at your word. Let's go.
Now VKR with the 2 negotiators.
Think about the juxtaposition. It started off as a huge crisis. Guns, grenades, bombs, a madman ready to kill everybody, to a few hours later, 3 guys walking out as friends. And that's how negotiations work.
The only time I saw Frank after the siege was at his committal hearing in Brisbane. As I walked past the dock, Frank was in handcuffs and he said, "Stop, can you stop, mate?" And I said, "Sure." He reached out, shook my hand and said, "Thanks for saving my life." And that was the start of my recovery, because I'd gone there with the intention of killing him if I had to, and I ended up saving his life. And that's when I started to come back to be Keith again, which is one of the defining moments of my life. Thank you. That's my Valour Award presentation with Commissioner O'Sullivan, who I had a lot of time for. I received 2 Valour Awards that day, one for my part in the MLC siege and the other for Operation Flashdance.
It was 7 years ago today, Tactical Response Team members stormed the Virginia House. Senior Constable Peter Kidd was the first through the door. The policeman died in hospital. Commissioner Jim O'Sullivan presented Shirley and Peter Kidd with the Police Valour Award accepted for their son.
When we lost him, it was very hard, but we've been nothing but proud of him.
I remember that every day. I've never forgotten what happened that day. Peter was a good friend of mine, and it's just a shame that he's not here to have a beer with me this afternoon. Pretty bittersweet day. I would have given it all away if Peter Kidd was still alive. I don't live in Queensland anymore, but whenever I'm in Brisbane, I try to make time to visit the police memorial in the Botanic Gardens, where Peter's selfless devotion to service has been honoured alongside those brave officers who fell in the line of duty. You're always in my heart, old mate.
Growing up, he was really playful. He was the fun dad. He did very bizarre things like built me a billy cart that we would take to the local park and just go down the same hill like over and over again. And we named it and we spray painted it and did all that stuff.
Very protective also, especially as we moved into our teenage years. I think some would say, especially 2 teenage girls would say overprotective at times, having known and seen what he did. But definitely, I think the flip side of that is that I always felt very, very safe. I think I first developed an understanding of the impact the police force had had on him when I was in my mid-teens. I would have been about 16 or 17.
I don't think there was any point where we learnt about Dad struggling with a mental illness. Things just clicked into place, over the years. But man, it became so much easier, to relate to one another and care for one another when we understood what was going on.
My mission today, I'm an author. I'm trying to find time to write my 3rd book, but I'm also a staunch advocate for the conversation around post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health. I've found it an incredibly cathartic exercise to write stuff down. Truth is, I have to confront my demons because I still live with them every day. Even now, I have this recurring nightmare about being in danger. There's someone in front of me who's threatening my life. Sometimes it's my old Smith & Wesson .38 revolver that I have in my hand. Sometimes it's a Glock 9mm pistol. I point it at him, need to shoot him, but the trigger doesn't move. The trigger won't move. That's a pretty scary dream. It's impossible to get out of. After my 2nd book was released, I had a phone call from a veteran VicPol armed robbery squad inspector who's become a friend of mine. He said, shit, mate, I read that part. And he said, I just went into cold sweats myself. And I said, why? He said, I've got the same dream. And I've spoken to ADF veterans, young men who fought in Afghanistan. They have the same dream. And the beauty of these conversations and connections is that you know that you're not alone. And that's so powerful. One guy I've reconnected with over the years is David Manfield, AKA the Ferret. He's the cop who roughed me up in Townsville thinking I was a drug dealer, when in fact, I was an undercover cop.
I got transferred to Brisbane and I spent a lot of time at the police club. And I met Keith there again. G'day Keith, how you going? The Ferret. He said, I know the Ferret. He said, thanks for the smack in the mouth. And I said, look, I really apologise again. He said, no need to apologise. He said, I would have done exactly the same thing. And we just started to talk. I could see he had some problems. At that time, I had PTSD, which I didn't know about. You never know, you've got it. You think you're normal, but you're not. I spoke about my service in Vietnam to him.
I was a good listener, and we just had this really great, cool relationship. I think he's about 10 years older than I am. And over the years, we've caught up, we've had a beer, we've had a chat about life, we've had a chat about those days, and he's just a really nice, genuine human being, and I'm proud to call him a mate. One of the luckiest days of my life was the day I met my future wife, Jenny. That was 30 years ago, and thankfully, we're still going strong. She's been incredible to deal with my stuff. She has put up with a lot of behaviour, and I think other less strong women would have left, for sure. I've apologised to my wife often.
We've had a few really beautiful, touching conversations, Dad and I, where he says, here's how I remember things, and I say, this is how I remember things, you know, which has ended up both in tears, you know, like in a really healing, beautiful way. And I'm very grateful for that, because not a lot of families and carers who have had their lives touched by mental illness get to see the resolution and the closeness that we do. But we are so close. Mm. Oh my God, it's so nice to have that family unit.
Every day, police officers put on a uniform and carry a weapon and go out to protect and serve and put themselves at risk. And I think what they have to go through and face on a daily basis, regardless of whether or not they're walking into an MLC insurance building to face someone who's holding sticks of dynamite, whether it's attending car crashes, talking to people who have been the victims of sexual assault, taking down crime reports, regardless of what work a police officer does, it affects them. We are so proud that Dad is championing that. People can't be what they can't see.
My PTSD I'm working through quite successfully. I don't think it ever goes away, but I'm certainly more comfortable and relaxed and able to accept that I have a disorder. So I'm in a good place.